The ache started in the arches of her feet, a low, persistent thrum that worked its way up her calves. Amara shifted the weight of her tote bag from one shoulder to the other, the cheap canvas strap digging into her skin through the thin fabric of her uniform. The light blue polyester dress, a constant reminder of her place, felt sticky in the humid evening air. Another 12-hour shift done. Another long walk to the bus stop on the deserted country road that led away from the sprawling estate. The only sound was the chirp of cicadas and the crunch of her worn sneakers on the gravel shoulder. The sun had bled out of the sky, leaving behind streaks of bruised purple and dusky orange. It was a beautiful sight, one she was usually too tired to appreciate. But tonight, another sound broke the quiet. A low, frustrated curse, sharp and clean, slicing through the evening calm. Up ahead, pulled onto the verge, was a car so red it seemed to steal the remaining light from the sky. It was low and sleek, a predator at rest. And standing beside it was a man. Even from a distance, the silhouette was unmistakable. The crisp, severe lines of a suit that cost more than she made in a year.
He was one of them.
The men who moved through the main house like ghosts, all dark suits and silent watchfulness. She served them coffee, cleaned their rooms, and did her best to become invisible. But this man was not one of the soldiers. He stood with an authority that was absolute, a stillness that commanded the very air around him. He was leaning over, staring at the rear tire.
Flat.
Utterly, completely flat. Amara's first instinct was to walk faster, to lower her head and melt into the growing dusk. Her grandmother's voice echoed in her head, "Mind the business that pays you, child." And her business was cleaning toilets and polishing floors, not getting involved with the kind of man whose tailored perfection seemed to mock the dusty, inconvenient reality of a flat tire. She kept walking, her eyes fixed on the road ahead. But she could feel his gaze on her as she drew level with the car. It was a heavy, physical thing. She chanced a look. He was tall, his black hair impeccably styled. His face was all sharp angles and shadows in the fading light, but it was his hands that caught her attention. One rested on the roof of the car, long fingers spread wide. They were clean, elegant hands, but they held a tension, a coiled strength that seemed at odds with their refined appearance. He was not looking at her with curiosity. He was looking at her like a problem he was assessing. He said nothing. He didn't have to. The silence was a question, a demand. "What are you looking at?" Her feet stopped moving of their own accord. The words left her mouth before she could stop them. "You got a flat." His eyes, dark and unreadable, narrowed slightly. A flicker of something, annoyance, maybe surprise. "I am aware." His voice was a low baritone, smooth as polished granite. No accent she could place, just the clipped, precise English of the international elite. "Do you know how to change it?" she asked, the question hanging in the air, audacious and stupid. He pushed himself off the car, turning to face her fully. The movement was fluid, economical. He moved like the world owed him space. "The spare is insufficient. My men are on their way." It was a dismissal, clear and final. He had a problem, but he did not need her kind of help. She should have nodded and walked away.
She should have been relieved.
Instead, a stubborn spark ignited in her chest. She had spent her entire day being dismissed, being invisible. "An insufficient spare is better than no spare," she said, her voice firmer than she expected. "It'll get you home." She gestured with her chin toward the trunk. The jack and the lug wrench should be in there. For the first time, his composure seemed to crack. Not in a big way, just a subtle shift in his posture. He was watching her, really watching her now. He saw the faded blue uniform, the sensible shoes, the exhaustion etched around her eyes. And yet, she was standing here on a dark road, telling him how to fix his car. "You know how to change a tire," he stated. It wasn't a question. "My daddy made sure I knew how to handle my own trouble," she replied, the memory of her father's grease-stained hands guiding hers bringing a faint, sad smile to her lips. She dropped her tote bag on the ground, popped the trunk. He didn't move for a long moment. The cicadas buzzed, filling the silence between them. She thought he was going to tell her to get lost, to mind her own business. Instead, he reached into his suit jacket, produced a key fob, and pressed a button. The trunk of the crimson car popped open with a soft, expensive-sounding click. What she did not know yet was that this simple act, this moment of accepting her help, was a transaction. In his world, help was never free. It always created a debt. She found the kit easily, pulling out the small jack and the wrench. She worked with a practiced efficiency, her movements sure and steady. He stood back and watched, his arms crossed over his chest. His silence was unnerving. It wasn't empty, it was weighted, analytical. He watched the way she braced the wrench with her body to loosen the tight lug nuts, the confident set of her jaw, as she worked the jack, the methodical way she laid everything out on the pavement. He was taking her apart with his eyes, studying every detail. The air smelled of dust, asphalt, and something else. A clean, sharp scent coming from him. Cedar and smoke. It was subtle, but it was there, a scent of power and money that didn't belong on this lonely stretch of road. Finally, the flat tire was off, the smaller spare securely in its place. She lowered the car, gave the lug nuts a final, forceful tighten, and stood up, wiping her hands on her apron. They came away smudged with black grease. "It's not meant for high speeds," she said, her voice a little breathless from the exertion. "But it'll get you to the mansion." He looked from her dirty hands to her face. The expression in his eyes was something she couldn't decipher. It wasn't gratitude. It was something colder, more complex. "You work at the house," again, a statement, not a question. "Yes, sir. Housekeeping." Before he could respond, twin beams of light cut through the darkness, approaching fast. A black SUV, the kind that looked like it was designed for war zones, pulled up silently behind his sports car. The engine was a low, menacing rumble. That was the moment everything changed. The air grew thick, heavy with unspoken threat. Two men in identical dark suits emerged from the SUV. They moved with the same lethal grace as the man in front of her. Their eyes scanned the surroundings, missing nothing, before they came to rest on her. They looked at her like she was a loose thread in a perfect tapestry, something to be snipped and discarded. The man in front of her straightened, his authority settling back over him like a cloak. He was no longer a stranded motorist. He was a king back on his throne. "Get in the car," he said to her. His voice was quiet, but it held the unyielding force of a command. Amara's blood went cold. "The bus stop is just up the road. I'll be fine." "That was not a request, miss." He paused, his head tilted slightly. "Amara," she supplied, her throat tight. "Amara Jones." He said her name, tasting it. Amara, he said it differently than anyone else ever had. Not soft, but precise, like an object he was cataloging. "Get in my car. Mr. Choi will handle this." One of the men from the SUV, older, with a scar that cut through his left eyebrow, gave a slight bow.
"Sir."
"The vehicle has been tracked." It was the Kims. A message. The man, her boss, she now realized with a sickening lurch, nodded slowly. His gaze was fixed on Amara. They were sloppy. They left a witness. He looked at her, and she understood. To them, she wasn't the help. She was a liability. She didn't have a choice. Arguing would be pointless. Running would be fatal. With her heart hammering against her ribs, Amara picked up her tote bag and walked to the passenger side of the red sports car. He opened the door for her. As she slid into the low leather seat, the smell of cedar, smoke, and danger enveloped her. The door closed with a solid, final thud, sealing her inside his world. The drive back to the mansion was suffocatingly silent. The engine purred, a low growl that vibrated through the leather seats. Amara stared straight ahead, her hands clenched in her lap, the grease on them feeling like a brand. She was acutely aware of him beside her. He drove with an unnerving calm, his hands resting lightly on the steering wheel, his focus on the winding road. But she could feel the energy radiating from him, a tightly controlled current of violence just beneath the surface. She worked for Kong Min-jun. The name was whispered among the staff, always with a mixture of fear and reverence. The owner, the master of the empire that stretched from Seoul to the very ground this mansion was built on. She had only ever seen him from a distance, a fleeting figure stepping out of a black car or crossing a distant marble hall. Now, she was sitting beside him, the intimate space of his car charged with a tension so thick she could barely breathe. He pulled the car not to the main entrance, but around to a private garage beneath the house. The massive door rolled up and then sealed behind them, plunging them into a world of concrete and fluorescent light. He cut the engine. The resulting silence was somehow louder than the noise had been. "Come," he said, his voice flat. He got out of the car, and she followed, her legs feeling unsteady. He didn't lead her to the staff quarters. He led her through a series of pristine, minimalist hallways she'd never been allowed to clean, up a private elevator paneled in dark wood, and into a sprawling study. One wall was a floor-to-ceiling window offering a breathtaking, glittering view of Seoul in the distance. The other walls were lined with books. A massive desk, carved from a single piece of dark wood, dominated the room. He walked to a wet bar in the corner and poured 2 glasses of water, his movements precise. He handed one to her. Her hand trembled slightly as she took it. "Sit," he commanded, gesturing to a leather armchair opposite his desk. She sat, perching on the edge of the cushion. He remained standing, observing her, his face an inscrutable mask. "You're new," he said. 3 months. She swallowed. "Yes, sir." How did he know that? Did he know everything about everyone who worked for him? "You live in Itaewon, a small apartment above a noodle shop. You send half of your wages to your mother in America. You have no family here." A cold dread washed over her. He wasn't guessing. He was reading from a file he already had in his head. She was no longer Amara Jones, a person. She was a collection of data points, a potential risk to be managed. "What do you want?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. He took a slow sip of his water, his dark eyes never leaving hers. "Competence is the only currency I value, Amara. Incompetence is a disease. It spreads. It creates vulnerabilities." He set his glass down on the desk with a soft click. He held up his right hand. There was a small, clean cut across his knuckles, beaded with a single drop of blood. He must have gotten it when he first tried to deal with the tire. "Years ago," he began, his voice low and devoid of emotion, "I had a driver. He was loyal, but he was a fool. He failed to check the vehicle before a journey. A simple, routine security check. A single wire, cut in the brake line." He paused, his gaze becoming distant, lost in a memory she couldn't see. The car went off the Han River Bridge. The driver survived. The woman in the back seat did not. He looked back at her, his eyes sharp and piercing again. "She was my sister. Incompetence killed her. But it was my enemy who cut the wire. They used his weakness against me. That was his wound. The ghost that haunted this perfect, cold fortress. A woman he had failed to protect." It explained the obsession with control, the layers of security, the absolute intolerance for mistakes. Just then, the door to the study opened silently. The man with the scarred eyebrow, Mr. Choi, entered and bowed his head.
"Sir."
"The Kims are getting bold. This was a test, to see if you could be isolated. They will be reminded of the cost of such tests." Mr. Choi's gaze flickered to Amara for a fraction of a second. "What about her?" "She was seen. She is a loose end." "She's a complication," Minjun corrected, his voice like ice. He turned his full attention back to Amara. "You cannot go home. Your apartment is no longer safe. The Kims know a woman was with me. They will assume you are important. They will come for you to get to me." The floor seemed to drop out from under her. This wasn't just a wrong place, wrong time situation anymore. She had been marked. A target. "You can't just keep me here," she protested, a note of hysteria creeping into her voice. "I can," he stated, the words absolute and final. "And I will. You will stay in the East Wing. My men will watch you. You will not leave the grounds. This is not negotiable." She could scream. She could fight. She could try to run from this gilded cage. But looking into his cold, determined eyes, she knew it would be useless. Running would only get her killed, either by his enemies or by his own men trying to contain the problem. Her only chance of survival was to stay here, under the protection of the very man who had dragged her into this mess. It was a choice made in a cage, but it was a choice nonetheless.
She would stay.
She would watch, and she would learn, and she would survive. She gave a single, sharp nod. Okay. A flicker of surprise in his eyes. He had expected her to argue. Her quiet compliance seemed to disarm him more than any outburst would have. He gave a curt nod to Mr. Choi. See that she is given a room. And clothes. Something other than that, he gestured dismissively at her uniform. Mr. Choi bowed and turned to her. This way, miss. As she stood up to follow him, Minjun spoke her name again.
Amara.
She stopped and turned back. He had walked around the desk and was standing in front of her, closer than before. The room suddenly felt very small. He looked down at her hands, still stained with grease and dirt from his car. Slowly, he reached into the breast pocket of his suit and pulled out a folded square of dark silk. A handkerchief. Before she could react, he took her right hand. His touch was light, almost clinical, but it sent a jolt through her. With painstaking gentleness, he began to wipe the grime from her fingers, his thumb moving in slow, deliberate circles over her skin. The gesture was so at odds with the cold man who had just sentenced her to imprisonment that her mind struggled to catch up. She stared at the top of his head, at the way his dark hair fell, at the intense concentration on his face as he performed this small, intimate task. When he was done, he held her clean hand for a moment longer, his thumb brushing over her knuckles. He lifted his head, and his eyes met hers. The silence stretched, thick and charged. In his dark gaze, she saw a flicker of something she couldn't name. It wasn't kindness. It was something more dangerous. A recognition. He saw the competence, the lack of fear where there should have been terror. He saw her. And in that moment, she knew she was in more danger than she could possibly imagine. Life in the mansion became a strange paradox. Amara was a prisoner living in the lap of luxury. The room she was given in the East Wing was larger than her entire apartment, with a balcony overlooking a meticulously manicured garden. The clothes that appeared in her closet were made of silk and cashmere, fabrics her skin had never known. She was served gourmet meals by maids who now looked at her with a mixture of fear and curiosity. She had gone from being one of them to being something else. His possession. Days bled into one another. She was watched constantly. A guard was always stationed, silent and unmoving, at the end of her hallway. She was not allowed to leave, not allowed to contact anyone from her old life. She read books from the study's vast library. She walked the gardens under the watchful eyes of his men, and she learned the rhythms of the house. She learned the sound of Minjun's footsteps in the hall, the low murmur of his voice during late-night meetings in his study, the scent of his cologne that lingered in a room long after he'd left. One evening, unable to sleep, she wandered into the library adjoining his study. The door was slightly ajar. She knew she shouldn't, but she was drawn by the low, intense murmur of voices. She pressed her ear to the cool wood. It was Minjun and Mr. Choi. The shipment at the Incheon docks is secure, Mr. Choi was saying. But the Kims have a man on the inside.
Lee.
He's been feeding them information for months. And what is being done about Lee? Minjun's voice was dangerously quiet. He's been brought here. He is in the warehouse. Good, Minjun said, his voice dropping even lower, laced with chilling finality. Make sure his family understands that loyalty is a debt paid in blood. His or theirs. Amara pulled back from the door, her own blood running cold. This wasn't an abstract danger anymore. It was real. A man named Lee was in a warehouse on these grounds, about to be executed because he had been disloyal. And his family was being threatened. She felt sick. This was the man who had so gently cleaned her hands. The casual brutality of his words should have sent her running, should have made her find a way out of this house, no matter the cost. But a strange, dark curiosity held her rooted to the spot. She was seeing the truth of him, the monster beneath the tailored suit. And she wasn't running. The next day, the threat became personal. She was in her room, reading by the open balcony doors, when she smelled it. A faint, cloying, sweet scent. The smell of gas. At the same time, the guard in the hall suddenly started coughing, a racking, choked sound. Her survival instincts, honed by a childhood in a rough neighborhood, screamed at her. She didn't hesitate. She grabbed the heavy crystal water carafe from her bedside table, ran to the door, and smashed the small glass panel next to the handle, creating a spiderweb of cracks. She reached through, unlocked the door from the outside, and pulled the choking guard into her room, slamming the door shut. She dragged him toward the balcony, into the fresh air. "Stay here," she gasped, her own lungs burning. She grabbed a silk scarf, soaked it with water from the carafe, and tied it around her nose and mouth. Then she ran back into the hallway, which was now thick with the smell. At the far end, she saw it. A small, almost invisible nozzle near the floor, connected to a thin tube that snaked under the carpet. It wasn't a leak. It was deliberate. Footsteps pounded up the stairs. Mr. Choi and two other guards appeared, their faces grim. They saw the scene. The gas, the broken door, Amara standing there with a soaked scarf over her face.
Moments later, Mignone arrived.
He didn't run. He moved with that same controlled, predatory speed. His eyes swept the scene, taking in every detail in an instant. But then they landed on her, and for the first time, she saw a crack in his icy control. A raw, undisguised urgency. He crossed the distance between them in two long strides, his hands reaching for her, checking her face, her arms, his gaze searching for any sign of injury. "Are you hurt?" he asked, his voice a low, rough growl. "I'm fine," she breathed, her heart hammering. "The guard. He will be taken care of." Minjun cut in, his eyes still locked on hers. He saw that she was not panicking, that she was assessing the situation just as he was. The fear was there, but it was underneath a layer of shocking composure. His hands were still on her arms, his grip firm, grounding. The near miss had stripped away the pretense between them. In that moment, he wasn't her captor, and she wasn't his prisoner. They were two people who had just survived an attack. Later, after the wing had been cleared and secured, he summoned her to his study again. He was standing by the window, staring out at the city. "They used one of the maids," he said without turning around. "A girl whose brother has a gambling debt to the Kims. They forced her to place the device." "What will happen to her?" Amara asked, though she was afraid of the answer. "She has been dealt with," he said, the words cold and final. He turned to face her. "This happened because of you. They are testing my defenses by targeting what they perceive as my weakness." Amara felt a surge of anger. "I never asked for this. I never asked to be your weakness." "No," he said, stepping closer. "You did not." He stopped in front of her, his presence overwhelming in the quiet room. "But you are." It was an admission that hung in the air between them, more intimate than a touch. This cold, calculating man was admitting she had a hold over him, a vulnerability he could not afford. The knowledge was terrifying and exhilarating. She decided then that she would not be a weakness. She would not be a pawn. A few days later, she was walking in the garden when she overheard two guards talking in low voices. They were new and careless. They spoke of a meeting Minjun was having the next night, at a restaurant in Gangnam. They mentioned the name of the restaurant, a detail she was sure was a security breach. She knew the Kims would be watching him, waiting for him to leave the safety of the mansion. That night, she couldn't sleep. She crossed a line. Using a hairpin, she jimmied the lock on a little-used service door and slipped out of her wing. She moved through the darkened house like a ghost, her bare feet silent on the marble floors. She made her way to the library, her heart pounding. She had to warn him. She found him in the study, pouring a drink. He turned as she entered, his body instantly tense, on alert. He saw her, barefoot and wearing a silk robe, and his expression shifted from alarm to something else, something dark and possessive. "You should be in your room," he said. "The meeting tomorrow," she said, her voice rushed. "At the restaurant. It's a trap. I heard the guards talking." He set his glass down, his eyes narrowing. He listened as she told him what she'd heard, his expression unreadable. When she was finished, he was silent for a long time. "The guards were my own test," he said finally. "A test of loyalty. I fed them false information to see if it would get back to the Kims." He paused. "It seems it got back to you instead." He walked toward her, and she had to fight the urge to step back. He stopped directly in front of her, so close she could feel the heat coming off his body. "You see things you are not meant to see," he said, his voice a low murmur. "You hear things you are not meant to hear. And you do not flinch." He reached out, his fingers tracing the line of her jaw, a touch that was both a caress and a threat. "That makes you more dangerous than any of my enemies." His honesty was a blow, stripping the air from her lungs. She met his gaze, refusing to look away. "I stopped seeing you as a monster," she confessed, the words tasting like recklessness on her tongue. "That's what makes me a fool." A muscle jumped in his jaw. The tension between them was a living thing, a wire pulled taut to the breaking point. He was going to kiss her. She knew it. She saw the decision in his eyes. And she knew she would not stop him. But before he could, Mr. Choi burst into the room, his face pale. "Sir," he said, his voice strained. "It's the Kims. They didn't take the bait. They went for the source." He held up a small, ornate hair comb. Amara recognized it instantly. It belonged to the young maid who had been forced to plant the gas device, the one Min-jun said had been dealt with. "They have the girl," Mr. Choi continued. "They sent this. And a message. A trade. Her, for the woman who was with you on the road."
A trade.
Her, for Amara. The Kims had made their move. They were no longer targeting his weakness. They were trying to rip it from his grasp. The warehouse was cold, smelling of rust and damp concrete. Amara's hands were bound behind her with a zip tie that cut into her wrists. The Kims hadn't come for her at the mansion. They had been smarter than that. They had used the maid, the one they now held, to send a message, a desperate plea for help delivered through a bribed kitchen worker, luring Amara to a supposedly safe meeting place just outside the estate walls. It was a foolish, emotional decision on her part, a belief that she could somehow help the girl, a belief the Kims had counted on. Now she was here, a piece on a chessboard, waiting for the final move. Across from her, tied to another chair, was the young maid, her face streaked with tears. The man in charge, Kim Jin-woo, the youngest son of the rival family, paced in front of them. He was nothing like Min-jun. He was loud, preening, his power born of bravado, not stillness. "He will come for you," Jin-woo sneered, stopping in front of Amara. The great Kong Min-jun. All for a little maid. He must be getting soft. Amara said nothing. She kept her face impassive, her mind racing. She wasn't a soldier. She wasn't a killer. But she was a survivor. She watched everything. She noticed the way one of the guards kept nervously checking his watch. She noticed the frayed electrical cord snaking from a generator to a bank of powerful work lights. She noticed a heavy fire extinguisher mounted on a nearby concrete pillar. She was not going to wait to be rescued. Hours passed. Then, the silence of the warehouse was broken. Not by a frontal assault, but by quiet, systematic chaos. The lights flickered and died, plunging the warehouse into near-total darkness, illuminated only by the emergency exit signs. Shouts of confusion erupted from the guards. That was Min-jun's signal. Amara acted. With her hands still bound, she threw her body sideways, toppling her chair with a loud crash. It was the diversion. Jin-woo and his men turned toward the sound, their guns raised. In that split second of distraction, the battle began. Min-jun's men moved from the shadows like wraiths. The sounds of suppressed gunfire, short, sharp pops, echoed in the vast space. It was precise, surgical. Jin-woo grabbed Amara, yanking her up by her arm and pressing the cold barrel of a pistol to her temple. "Stop," he screamed into the darkness. "Or she dies." The warehouse fell silent again. Amara could feel Jin-woo's body trembling behind her.
He was terrified.
Let her go, Jinwoo. Minjun's voice came from the darkness, calm and lethal. This is between you and me. You'll kill me anyway. Jinwoo shrieked, his grip tightening. Amara knew this was her moment. She was not a damsel. She would not be a bargaining chip. The guard on your left, she said, her voice low but clear, speaking to Jinwoo. He keeps checking his watch.
He has somewhere to be.
Someone he cares about more than you. The guard flinched. Jinwoo's head twitched in his direction, his focus breaking for a crucial half-second. It was all the opening she needed. Amara stomped down hard on Jinwoo's instep with her heel. He grunted in pain, his grip loosening infinitesimally. She slammed her head back, connecting with his nose with a sickening crunch. He staggered back, roaring in pain and surprise. She didn't stop. She ran, stumbling in the dark, straight for the fire extinguisher. The battle erupted again. Minjun used the opening she had created. As she reached the pillar, a bullet grazed her arm, a line of fire searing across her skin. She ignored it, fumbling with the clasp on the extinguisher. She pulled the pin, aimed the nozzle back into the fray, and squeezed the handle. A massive cloud of white chemical foam billowed out, creating a wall of blinding, choking confusion. Through the chaos, a hand grabbed her arm. It wasn't rough. It was firm, certain.
Amara, Minjun.
He pulled her behind him, shielding her with his body as he fired 2 precise shots into the swirling white cloud. A heavy thud followed. The fight was over. In the aftermath, back in the silence of his study, the adrenaline began to fade, leaving behind pain and exhaustion. Minjun was cleaning the gash on her arm himself. He worked with an intense, focused gentleness, his touch sending shivers down her spine that had nothing to do with the cold. The cost of the night was clear. Mr. Choi had taken a bullet to the shoulder, and 2 of Minjun's men were dead. The war with the Kims was over. Jinwoo's death had ended it, but the victory was paid for in blood. When he finished bandaging her arm, he didn't let her go. He held her hand, his thumb stroking the back of it. He looked at her and the mask was gone. All of it. In his eyes, she saw the terrifying depth of what he felt. They took you to break me, he said, his voice raw. They did not understand. He lifted her bandaged arm and pressed a soft, reverent kiss to the clean, white gauze. You are not my weakness. He looked up, his dark gaze locking with hers, a vow passing between them in the silence. You are the only part of my empire that is not for sale, not for trade, and not negotiable. It was not a declaration of love. It was a statement of fact, a claim. In his world, a world of assets and territories, she was the one thing that was priceless. Absolute. She didn't pull away. She didn't say a word. She simply held his gaze, accepting the weight of his declaration, accepting the woman she had become. Later that night, she stood on the balcony of his bedroom, looking out over the glittering sea of lights that was Seoul. She was no longer wearing the clothes of a prisoner, but a black silk robe that felt like a second skin. It belonged here. She belonged here. The cool night air felt good on her face. The city below seemed like a different world, a world she no longer belonged to. She had crossed a line, and she could not go back.
She didn't want to.
She heard him come to stand behind her. He didn't touch her, but his presence was a solid, warm wall at her back, a silent promise of protection and possession. He didn't ask if she was staying. He didn't need to. The choice had been made in the cold of the warehouse, in the heat of the fight, in the quiet of his study. She saw her reflection in the dark glass of the balcony door, her face, her eyes, the white bandage on her arm. She saw a woman who had walked into a monster's world and had not been devoured. She had become something else, something more. And as she stared at the stranger in the glass who was finally, terrifyingly herself, she did not turn away.